Okay, I'm Jim Heavner. I was born in 1939. And I would say also that I'm honored and grateful to you, Mike, and Susan Newberry, who's up there taking these pictures, that you are at this stage in my life giving me a time to do some recollections that I hope will be beneficial to my grandchildren's children. I didn't have the opportunity to know my grandparents very well because they died when I was just a really young kid. And I'm fortunate to know my 6 wonderful grandkids pretty well, and they've probably heard enough grandpa stories, but I really regret not having had a better chronicle of my parents' lives and my grandparents' lives. I've really regretted that, and so I'm hoping that maybe this will be meaningful to those kids, because I'm so blessed, and I mean this not in some sort of hyperbolic rhetoric, but very literally, that if you know my 3 daughters, I'm 3 for 3, and then at a time when marriages are challenging, 3 sons-in-law who I would take as sons, and 6 granddaughters, or 6 grandchildren, 5 granddaughters and a grandson, all of whom are fabulous, healthy, competent, capable people. I got a sister who is in every way an inspiration to me, and the best wife in the world. Now, all of that is true, and that's not just me. Everyone who knows any of them or all of them agrees with me on that, and that makes me so extraordinarily fortunate. And I think it's important for my great-grandchildren to know that about their parents and their grandparents, and how lucky the great-great-grandparent was when he sat here and talked to you on this, what is this, November the 15th, I guess, November 15th of 2018.
17.
2017.
Don't
well,
make it
I
any
was
worse.
always
There we go.
I was always a little ahead of
That's
my time.
okay. Well, let's go back and let's start
Okay.
your story. You're born in
Sure.
1939 in Kings Mountain,
Yeah.
North Carolina. Let's tell people where that is.
Yeah. Kings Mountain is a small textile town in southwest North Carolina, about 30 miles west of Charlotte is the way most people would know it. We would say it was between Gastonia and Shelby. And it was the big city just slightly up the road from Bessemer City, where Don Curtis was born, and he and I knew each other from high school, and so I've always pointed out to them that I was the big city guy, because the population of Kings Mountain was 7,203 in 1957 when I left it. It was a wonderful place to grow up. If you'd like, I can go from there to the sort of the first memories that I have of Kings Mountain.
Tell us about that, and it's in Cleveland County.
It's in Cleveland County.
Yeah, but you were there a short period of time before your family actually moved. But tell us a little bit about your mom and dad.
Yeah. Well, my mom and dad grew up, and if you think about it, I was born in 39. They were born about 20 years earlier. So if you think about that, they had their formative years during the Depression, and in a small hardscrabble town in the South, it was all textiles. It was interesting. It was they would probably demographically be described as poor. I don't have any recollection of them ever talking about being poor. I can remember that they talked about having to leave school early because they needed to work. In that era, in that culture, in that part of the world, that was not so unusual. And if you're living the way all the other folks are living, and you've got a home, and you've got food on the table, and maybe a couple of hogs in the pen out back, and some chickens, and a garden, and a grocer that liked you, and a church that you belonged to, where you found comfort and were welcomed, then it was really a pretty. They would say that it was, their version was that it would be a pretty good life and would probably be offended if anyone thought of them as poor. And they were great parents. I can elaborate a little more on that when we get into the later years, but I was fortunate to be born to a mom and dad who just every single thing about it makes my heart overflow with joy at how lucky I was.
Any other brothers and sisters?
I have a sister named Carolyn. She was born, actually my birthday was September 30th, and her birthday was August 29th. And so that meant that I was still seven when she was born. And so when Carolyn was born, and my parents, indulging their only child at that time, let me name her, and I liked the name Carolyn, and that's how she got that name. And so I've always said that Carolyn was 7 years younger than I was, but in fact it was really 7 years and 11 months, and so she years later pointed out to me that I'm really 8 years older than she is, and she's just an extraordinary woman, just really very accomplished in her own right. Great leader in Raleigh, ran the Triangle's largest residential real estate office, and was president of the Raleigh Board of Realtors and active on the state real estate board, and has always been one of the smartest people I've ever known, one of the most interesting people that I've ever known, and I'm really lucky to have a sister who is with whom I have that bond. I say that literally because I'm at an age now where I observe that that's not always true in all families, and I have some pain for those folks who somehow don't enjoy their siblings as much as I have always enjoyed mine.
So you're in Kings Mountain, and you're there about 3 years, and then your parents move because your dad gets a job somewhere else. Yeah. Tell us about that.
So my dad was working in the mill in Kings Mountain, where wages were, well, they were just low. They were textile wages. And he got word that the federal government was employing carpenters on what he heard was some sort of secret project up in Tennessee. And he embarked on finding out about it and wound up going to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where he became a carpenter on the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was the project that the United States government and military had undertaken to develop the atomic bomb. We were in World War II, and there was a mad race to develop this bomb. The theory was well known, but no one had mastered the practice. And the United States was putting an all-out effort to get that before the Germans did. And the pay was terrific. And it sort of had to be because Oak Ridge was built on the side of a mountain in Tennessee, wrapped inside barbed wire, miles and miles and miles of barbed wire. And the life-changing experience that was for me is that when Mom and Dad, then Dad went first, and then Mom and I came there when I was, I believe, just turning 3 years old. So then, if you think back to it, if you're the federal government and you want the smartest chemists, physicists, and scientists in the world to come and live on the side of this mountain, to take this uranium and figure out how to turn it into a bomb, what kind of schools would you have for the children of the smartest scientists in the world? They would be federally government-sponsored schools that were the best that you could possibly imagine, and their children were the kind of children you would expect of families like that. And they were my classmates, and those were the schools that I went to from age 3 to age 6. And that changed my life, because then when the war was over, we moved back to Kings Mountain in 45, late 45. They put me in the first grade, and I was so far ahead of the class that they really didn't know what to do with me. And that had great benefits, and it also had some liabilities. And I have an abundant awareness, I think, of both of them. One is that the teachers were really indulgent to me. My parents could have moved me ahead a grade, but I was already the youngest guy in class and a small kid. So if they had moved me ahead another year, I would have been 2 years younger than most of the class and really a little kid. So I stayed in my class, and I was probably teacher's pet just about every year.
So now you're back in Kings Mountain, and there's a local radio station there. When did you first get interested in any kind of broadcasting or media?
Well, I would say that around age 11, and I think about that because I believe that that's the year, somewhere around age 10 or 11 is when the radio station went on the air. We probably ought to look that up, but I believe that's when it went on the air, around 52 or 53. And I was fascinated by that. At the same time that I was also had my first real job, other than riding with Dad was a dry cleaner. I would ride with Dad on his dry cleaning route a lot, and then he then owned a dry cleaner, and so I had that work experience. Dad had paid me sometimes 50 cents a day, but now I got a paper route at about the same time that the radio station opened, and my bicycle, it was almost like a divining rod. My bicycle took me to the radio station, to the sound of where this noise was coming from. And I remembered the first time I went there, I don't think I even went in the door. I went in and looked in the window, sitting on my bike, and I could see those people in there, and the microphones and the records. And I thought that just really looked like a lot of fun.
Now, carrying papers, what paper did you carry?
So I delivered the Charlotte News.
Ah, there.
It was my first sales experience, and it was a great experience for me, Mike. I learned a lot, I think, about me in that, because I was just a kid living a sort of a Tom Sawyer life, Boy Scouts, playing ball in the yard. You know, one of the many wonderful accidents in my life is that in that small little town we lived on the corner lot. And of course there was a right of way for the narrow streets, and this meant that we had the big yard. And the big yard was the place then that kids would come and play ball at our house. And so it was all I've always described very Tom Sawyerish and really wonderful. And then I had a chance to get this paper out, and I loved it. I sort of loved everything about it. And there are two things about it that come to mind. The first of all was the business part of it. And if you were successful in adding customers to your paper route, then you got little prizes. You could get you might get a pen, a Charlotte News pen, or you might get a sewing kit, or you might get some prize. And while I was there, they had there was a contest that if you achieved a certain level of increase in your business, that you would win a trip, a 3-day trip, 2 nights, 3 days to Charlotte. I was mesmerized. See, I thought Charlotte, you had to cross the Catawba River to get to Charlotte, and I thought it would be like going across the Atlantic Ocean.
How far was it in miles?
30 miles.
30 miles.
But you were going to go there. And I think there's a life lesson in that I think I would want to give to my grandkids and their kids. And that is that I can remember that I thought that was the coolest thing in the world, but I had a few of my friends, when I told them about what I was going to do to get more customers would look askance with a certain combination of sympathy and cynicism, suggesting to me that the Charlotte News was just taking advantage of me to get me to do something as stupid as going to Charlotte, and who wanted to go to Charlotte anyway. And I remember that really well because they didn't seem to share my excitement about it. And I think it's when I sort of figured out that this gee whiz thing is pretty good, because I doubled the route.
Wow.
30 customers over a period of whatever it was, went to 60. And I struck a deal with the distributor, the fellow who would deliver the papers, and every week I would say, if you'll give me another 6 or 8 papers, or 6 to 10 papers each week, I'm going to go put them for a week on the porch of the people that aren't subscribing on my route. And then after a week, I'm going to come by and knock on their door and tell them that I've been the one sending them the News and Observer, and would they now, the Charlotte Observer, Charlotte News, and would they now like to start paying for it? Sure, 11-year-old kid, 30 cents a week. It's a nickel a paper, and it just worked.
It worked.
My dad was a dry cleaner, and when he came back from World War II, came back to Kings Mountain, he started working for the local dry cleaner, and he was a route man. In those days, everyone sent their clothes to the cleaners through a route man. It was like the delivery man. And I would ride with Dad in the summertime, particularly on those hot days, through all the towns, and so the doors would be open, and there was no air conditioning, and you could hear from one side of the house to the other. And my dad's name was Plato Heavner, Plato. And Dad would knock on the door, and they would say, "Who's there?" And he would say, "It's Plato, here to get you dry cleaning." Now, Mike, there was no qualifying of the prospect, no features and benefits, no pricing. It was, "Okay, just a minute." And then he would say, "When am I going to get them back?" And he would say, "Well, how about Thursday?" And they would say, "That'll be fine." And Daddy loaded it up, and he loaded, and Dad would load his car. He actually, one time, I think the axle actually broke in the car, because he was loading it up with so many clothes, and he was collecting more dry cleaning than like the next 4 guys put together, just because he would knock on more doors and assume the clothes. He would assume that if he was standing on the porch, that they would let him do the dry cleaning. And I learned a lot about that. That was really good. So I did the same thing when I was delivering the Charlotte News.
And did you win the contest?
Oh, I won the contest, and I was the I had in certain areas had some more confidence, I think, as a result of the Oak Ridge experience and all that, than some of my peers. And I think the guys at the Charlotte News, they liked me. They would invite me over to the hotel room, and I would sit there and kibitz with them while they played poker and talk about life. And then we went to WTVD in Charlotte, the TV station where we saw the TV stars. I thought that all the TV stars were bigger than God. They were all just, they were all big stars, and I loved all of that. And we toured the museum and the Lance Packing Company, and
what a thrill for a young kid, though.
And it was fantastic. And I just thought a lot about how lucky I was that I was too innocent to be cynical, and my reporter skepticism that would come along later had not yet really emerged. While I was delivering the Charlotte News and began to think about the radio station, my parents had also encouraged me to enter the school speech contests. We had something called declamation contests, in which those who entered would memorize a little 5-minute speech, 5, 6, 7-minute speech, and then you would deliver that speech before the school audience, and then the judges would give you prizes for it. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, at about age 10 or 11 or 12, my parents, my hardworking parents, arranged for me to have a speech coach in Kings Mountain around 1948, 49. Have to think about that. What caused them to be
They saw something.
parents? Well, it was just they were intelligently loving parents and really committed to the things that I had a passion about. And so I had this speech coach. So now when I was delivering the Charlotte News, and when I would be get the papers, and you'd wrap, while you were wrapping the rubber band around the papers, I would take a little time and read the front page of the paper aloud to see how I should be performing this if I were on the radio. And that's where it started. So then then I started doing the high school radio show.
Tell us about that.
I don't remember very much about it, except that we did a radio program that was on about once a week.
Was it on WKMT?
It was on WKMT.
On the local radio station.
On the local radio station.
Yeah.
And that got me in the door.
Wow.
And then and then I started doing my first sports thing. The happiest accident, I was not a very good athlete, but when I was a sophomore in high school, I broke my arm. I was shooting a layup in the gym. The coach took me to the doctor, so now I've got a big old cast on my arm, and it healed very slowly. And the coach, being the typical gruff, demanding coach that he was, gave me the clipboard and told me to be the statistician. And then when we got to our first game, he said, "Well, Heavner, you're probably not good for anything else. Why don't you go over there and announce the lineups?" And so I went over to the PA system in the school, and guess what? Mm-hmm. I liked it, because now I had everyone's attention, and I was the public address announcer. That carried over into baseball. American Legion Junior Baseball was huge in those days. In a town of 7,000 people, 3,000 or 4,000 people would come to the baseball games. And I was the PA announcer. And
your age at this time was?
Probably 14.
Yeah.
And the sports editor of the Kings Mountain Herald came over one day and said, one evening, and he said, "Hey, son, you've got that, you doing the thing, you look like you like that, but we could use somebody to report these scores on the radio. Would you be interested in doing that?" And you can imagine how long it took me to say yes. And so my first radio show was the American Legion Junior Baseball Report. And I was so young, Mom and Dad had to drive me to the radio station to do that. And then I started hanging around. I started doing the Sunday morning church remotes. And the truth is, it was a great way to kind of get out of church, because I would go from church to church, sit in the back room, do this and play radio. But that put me in radio. And one morning, or one day that I was there, the manager came in and gave me $4. He says, "Jimmy, you're doing a good job on the remote. Here's $4. Well, then I was a professional.
So was that Mr. Bridges?
That would have been Jonas Bridges.
Yeah.
Who hired Don Curtis, and he hired me, and he hired a bunch of others. He was one of the owners. He was one of the owners.
My gosh, what would Jonas Bridges say about you now?
Well, it's interesting. Jonas was both an inspirational boss and a tough boss. He was pretty demanding. His wife, Doris, also worked at the station, and she was. I really learned a lot from her. She was. She had a softer side than Jonas did, and so he would be the tough guy, and she would be the. It was a good cop, bad cop thing that they had together. But Jonas was he let me run. He put me on the air. Was making and if you think about it, I was making $1 an hour. Now Don Curtis came along with a better deal later on, but at that time, $1 an hour, that's what the grown-ups in the mill were making.
Mm-hmm. That was adult pay, and you were a teenager.
That was adult pay, doing adult work in an adult world to adult standards.
Mm-hmm.
That actually there was a degree of learning taking place there that was certainly not taking place in the classes in high school, because I was a terrible student.
So how long did you stay at the radio station?
Till I graduated from high school.
And about when would that have been?
That would have been in the 1957.
1957. It was time to go to college. What were your aspirations? Where did you want to go?
Oh, there was never any question. I was going to Chapel Hill. And this was before you worried about getting in. You just knew that you were going to get in. And you just kind of went. It's I remember when I was about 11 or 12, I don't know, 10, 11, 12, riding around with Dad. We were talking about what were you going to do when you grew up, and I thought, well, maybe I kind of liked the idea. I already liked the media business, and maybe I would work for the Kings Mountain Herald. And I just remember Dad saying, no, son, you won't stay here. There's nothing for you here. And I said, oh, okay. And from that time on, the idea that I would come to school in Chapel Hill was taken as a foregone conclusion. And so I came here in 1957 and was about as unprepared for college as I could possibly be.
So Jim, let's go back for just a second. You talked about going on to Chapel Hill. But let's go back when you were in high school. You also had a reporting job. Tell us a little bit about that. You were a reporter for the Charlotte newspaper.
Oh, sure. I'd forgotten that. Yeah, those were... Well, if we think for a moment about the incredible experience I had in high school, that honestly was different from anyone else in the school that I knew about. And I think it was the beginning of somewhere along the way of a progressive understanding that I was sort of an oddity. The business school here got interested in that years later, and at the time, I wasn't thinking about that. I just wanted to do. I just had a curiosity, and I thought that I wanted to be a reporter. And we started with just calling in the scores on Friday night to the Charlotte Observer.
That was an extension of what you were doing on the radio.
Yeah, and
announcing.
And then I was wrote an article for either the school paper or the Shelby Star. I'm not sure which. I think it may have been for the school paper. And have some concern about talking about this element of it, because it probably makes me sound more accomplished than I was at that time, but it was a seminal moment, so I will tell you. I was in the ninth or 10th grade, but I think ninth grade journalism class. It was supposed to be a junior class, but I will work my way into that, and also in the ninth grade, work my way into typing class. And the journalism teacher asked me to stay after school, and came in and proceeded to give me a lecture on plagiarism. And I didn't really know anything about plagiarism, but she began to tell me how unethical it was, how dishonest it was, and how in the media business it was important to never bring in, not steal other people's work, put my name on it. And I remembered, it was quite an admonition. And when I asked her what she was talking about, she handed me the article that I had written. She says, "Where'd you get this?" And she operated on the assumption that there were elements to it that whatever I was, a 13-year-old kid probably was not had not produced. And I promised her that I had done it. And the only thing that I could do was ask her, I said, give me another assignment and I'll write another story. I hope it was okay. But that suggested to me that I had a leg up on this. That goes back to Oak Ridge. It goes back to language skills and that I was a little bit ahead of my time. Now, so as a result of that, I wound up writing for the Shelby Daily Star, and I became a stringer for the Charlotte Observer. And at one time, I'd written a story for the Observer. I can't remember what it was, but instead of just saying, it says, Cleveland County Bureau. My bedroom with my little $35 Royal typewriter was the Bureau or something.
You were the Cleveland County Bureau. Now, clarify something for us
yeah.
at this point, because you mentioned two papers.
Yeah.
There were two at that time. The Charlotte News and the Charlotte Observer, or were they the same one?
They were the morning and afternoon paper.
Morning and afternoon.
My recollection, and it's a recollection that that's been a long time ago. It was the Charlotte paper, and I have because I think that it started with the Charlotte Observer because I would call in the scores to the Charlotte Observer. They wanted all the high school scores to put in an agate form on Saturday mornings, and I would call them. That's how we got into that. So I was writing for the Shelby Star, and then I was working at the radio station, and I was the president of the. We had a student broadcasting club, and then we had a student dramatics club, and I was in the school plays, and I was doing working the radio in the afternoon, and
you were busy fellow.
And I was also for a year or two I was in the band, and having the most fun. I was doing everything but studying, and I was just blessed that I had not had a particularly distinguished high school principal, but in my senior year, had an extraordinary principal, Ernest Lawson Brown, and it was very important because I think he saw that something in this kid who wasn't going to class very much. I was in school, but I was working on projects, and the teachers didn't like me not going to the class, and he was very helpful in giving me life lessons about the importance of my making a commitment to the classes where I didn't think I was learning anything because I was too busy learning at the radio station. And he would take me downstairs to the boiler room, and we would sit on milk crates where he could smoke and talk to me about life. And he then went on to become the superintendent of schools over in Lexington, for the county in which Lexington, North Carolina exists. And so we sort of kept up a bit during my time in college. He would come here for continuing education things and always look me up, and was a fairly important early mentor to me.
Well, you had a very interesting high school career, and I can see how this is going. Let's talk about Chapel Hill. You graduate from high school in 1957. You enroll in Chapel Hill. How long did it take you to get involved with the media in Chapel Hill?
Oh, about a day and a half, because WUNC at that time had volunteers. It was WUNC in those days was pretty much a student-run operation. And as I'd said earlier, I came to Chapel Hill. This was, I think, the second year that they did the SAT, where we had to take an exam. I'd gone over to Shelby on a Saturday morning believing that I was going to sign up. I didn't know anything about the SAT. I'd never heard of it. I wasn't really sure I was going to take a test. I knew that I had to fill some things out. And so on a Saturday morning, I went over there about 10 o'clock, and then they handed us this test, and we started taking the test. And somewhere in the middle of that, I realized that I was not going to be through by 12 noon when I was supposed to start my job at the radio station. So about 11 o'clock, I asked whoever was there, the proctor, if I could call Jonas and tell him that I thought I wasn't going to get there for my shift that was supposed to start in an hour. And I remember he was not very happy with me because that's not a whole lot of notice.
So were you working weekends back in Kings
Oh
Mountain?
yeah. Oh
Okay.
no. This was in high. I'm still back in.
Okay.
I'm having the first University of North Carolina experience was when I took these SATs.
Oh.
So in the middle of all of that, I thought, well, this is good. I've now done what I needed to do. Well, it turned out that I had a terrific SAT score. So I showed up here with teachers' kind of high expectations, and they placed me in English 2 and placed me out of a few of the first things. But I was clueless. I did not know how to study. The typical study that is applied to how you come home and take a few hours out and block it and do structured studying. And so my first semester at UNC was a bimodal existence. I started working immediately. First 2 or 3 days, I went to WUNC and I read, and they said, yep, you can do this. And so I started working evenings. I'm not sure whether it was every evening, but it was.
And this was the campus radio station.
It was WUNC. It was a big power. You could hear it, power radio station.
Run by students at the campus, but it had quite a reach.
That's right. We had a campus person, but the whole thing was run by students. All student volunteers played, and it was classical music. It was all classical music.
So the format was classical music.
Yeah.
It was run by the students at UNC Chapel Hill.
Yes.
But it had a tremendous reach throughout North Carolina.
It certainly did throughout the Piedmont, I would say. Yeah, because it was what we now know as a Class C FM.
And tell us again, what were your jobs there? What were
I
you
was
volunteering?
an announcer.
You were an announcer.
And that worked fairly well because you were playing music and you would have ostensibly some time for study. And so I did some of that. But I had the housing office, and this is sort of critical to that first experience in Chapel Hill. It was really a bad time. The housing office had made a mistake, and although I had planned to live with Harold Jackson from Kings Mountain, who was a sophomore and would have been a year older than me, they misassigned someone else to the other spot in that room. And when I got there, it was taken, so I wound up at the housing office, and they put me over in Cobb dorm, in the football dorm, and my roommate was a football player who was not a very good student and was not a very healthy guy. He beat me up a couple of times.
Oh, no.
And so I was really struggling with school, and that's where Swag Grimsley, Joe Grimsley, who was a student there on the GI Bill. He was a freshman also, but he was 4 years older than I was. And he was living right down the hall from me. And he said, what's going on up there isn't very good, Jim. I think my roommate's about to flunk out. And as soon as he does, we're going to put you in his spot. And he moved in, and he became my mentor. And he inspired me. He was very committed to public service. He wound up being Jim Hunt's right-hand man. He was Jim Hunt's right-hand man up through the Helms campaign in the 70s or 80s, whenever. I think that was in the 80s. 84, I believe, is when the Helms Hunt campaign took place. So for about 25 years. Well, that put me close to the notion of public service and began to set, it sort of opened the door to some things that were going to come a few years later when I had a chance to work at CHL. So I worked at the WNC. I then had a chance to go in the spring of the year. I took a job at the News Bureau, working for Pete Ivey, where I was where you did all the things. I was a proofer. And
this was at
the UNC News Bureau.
UNC News Bureau.
The UNC News Bureau. In those days, the news was cranked out on those waxy, I think we called them Surlocks machines, and then we would proofread. And I learned about proofreading. You would read each of the stories out loud to one of your colleagues. Then it was all over. We would run them off on the machine, stuff the envelopes, and then we would take them to the post office. And so then I was in the Chapel Hill in the professional media business, so to speak. And and then through the spring, my classwork improved spectacularly with Joe Grimsley as my roommate, who saved my life. He saved my life. Had Swag Grimsley not been there and not existed, I might not have made it through that first year. The ball player who had beaten me up a few times, he was thrown out of school sometime in the spring, and he was long gone. I can't even remember his name, but I remember that it was a pretty terrible situation, and Swag rescued me. So then I heard a rumor that one of my classmates said that WCHL had a couple of students who were graduating. They hired students, and I went out there in the spring and applied for a job.
And who did you meet with? Did you meet with Sandy McClamrock?
Ty Boyd and Sandy McClamrock.
Mm-hmm. And they own CHL.
Sandy owned WCHL, and Ty Boyd was his manager. And wow, I mean, it was just unlike anything I had ever seen.
What was the format of that radio station?
Well, we were a good music station.
What
and
does
let
that
me
mean?
say that a little slower. We were a good music station. What's sort of funny about it is that CHL really always was a nursing bed for great talent. Ed Myers, who was on his way from graduation to Charlotte to WSOC, then on his way to WTOP in New York, and then Barry Clark, who was the son of one of the sort of legendary announcers on WBT in Charlotte. He went on to the Voice of America. I mean, these were really big-time talents, but they were finishing their senior year, and I was coming in after my freshman year, and of course I just was in awe by their talent. And I can just remember that Ty told me that we only played good music, and all I did was start playing the music that I didn't have any idea what good music. Well, I didn't know what that meant, but I just played what Barry and Ed played, and it turned out that they were playing all their favorite jazz. The year they were really playing music that Ty didn't like particularly well, so he brought me in. We had a discussion of what good music was.
So what would be some of the songs that you played then?
Well, it was all four freshmen: June Christie, Stan Kenton, Andy Williams. It was
kind of what they might call later on.
It was MOR.
Right.
It was a middle of the road
music of your life, kind of.
Yes, but it was. We certainly were not playing rock and roll. As a matter of fact, I developed an affinity for music from the 40s because we played a lot of big band music. And I think we did that. That was, if we go back on it, it was probably not terribly well informed because later on we came to recognize that as programming according to personal music prejudice of the owner. But the community loved it, especially older people.
So did you have a regular shift at CHL?
I was an announcer, and I think, Mike, I got that job because I was willing to stay in the summer and work.
Mm-hmm.
The way you got the job was you went in, read 5 minutes of news and 5 minutes of commercials or something, and you would take your application and wrap a little rubber band around it, a little 3-inch reel, and throw it in a pasteboard box where all the other applicants' tapes were. And while I was in the room, I would sneak a listen to a few of them, and they were really good, a lot better than I was at that time, but I don't think they were available. So I got the job. And working for Ty and Sandy was the happiest accident that could ever possibly happen. I was ready for them, and they made me feel like the king of the world. They were just really, were great bosses.
Well, that's true. And did you continue with them through your time at Chapel Hill?
Yeah, Sandy was on the town council. He subsequently, 4 years later, ran for mayor and was mayor for 8 years. And public service was seen as a part of what you were supposed to do. And Ty was simply the most exuberant, positive, effusive person maybe I'd ever known. And he just every day would tell you how terrific you were, as he would then grab you by the nape of the neck and give you a little lecture on some things you could do better. And I loved him. I love him now. He was just an extraordinary leader for Jim Heavner in 1958, at a time when I needed to get the Kings Mountain rough edges knocked off, and he was terrific at that. And then Sandy, who was the mayor, who was on the town council and owned the station, Sandy was in a lot of ways the opposite personality. He was as quiet as Ty was effusive, but he had a bearing about him that caused you to want to please him, because I had seen him. That we're talking about folks who are 10 years older, 10 to 15 years older than I was, and that makes a big difference when you're there and you're still 17 years old.
So great mentors.
Just great mentors.
Well, how did you have time to go to school?
Well, I didn't have. So therein lies the rub. I was not a very good student, and I continued to work at it. My grades got middling, good enough to pass, and was just sort of lumbering along. And then sometime in 59, somewhere in there, Jack West, who was graduating from UNC, should not start that again. Jack, who was graduating, UNC, was the staff announcer at TVD, and he said, they've got this evening job open for a staff announcer. Would you like to do it? And I went over, read for that job. And
this was WTVD TV.
TV.
And tell us who owned WTVD.
And it was owned at that time, I think it was in the process of being sold at that time by Floyd Fletcher, who was another one of the sons of A.J. Fletcher. A.J. Fletcher, it was the founder of WRAL TV in Raleigh.
The other station in town.
The other station. And so we had the same family in the beginning owned both TV stations. But one of them was Floyd's, and one of those was AJ's and Fred's. And in that family, AJ, who was a wonderful, brilliant, wily, also with a very eclectic, since he was great on the radio and also loved the opera. He founded the North Carolina Opera Theater, and a really brilliant entrepreneur. Along the way, he had a daughter who married a fellow named Goodman, and that daughter brought us Jim Goodman, who AJ anointed. He leapfrogged over his sons and their cousins to put Jim Goodman in charge of the operation, and as they say, the rest is they say in history, because Jim Goodman was up to the task and went on to do incredible things over there. But at that time, they were just the Fletcher family. And so I was working at the TV station, and I was the only announcer. We had one other person that would come in and I think do one of the newscasts. But from 4 in the afternoon till 11,
you were the announcer at WTVD?
if they had the fun house, we had the cartoon show. And so there was a big flat, as we call it, on the screen. So you had 3 big circles, and then the fun house right over the top of it. And I think that was the title of the show. You had Porky Pig sticking his head out of one of the circles, and Bugs Bunny over here with his head coming out of another. In the middle circle was me, my head with a little bowler hat. Hi, kids. And I introduced the cartoons. That would have been the 5 o'clock show. And then at 6
And a live audience of children locally.
No, it was just in the studio.
In studio, yeah.
It was just in the studio.
Yeah.
And and it was all ad-libbed, and it was all live. There was no videotape. No videotape. This meant that every commercial where there was a stand-up on it had to be done live. And we also didn't have any teleprompters. They would so that you could see the script, you would write it out in long copy paper in the AP newsprint paper, and the cameraman would lock the camera down, and he would scroll the copy by you as you did the Belk's commercial or the automobile commercial or the Sears commercial, and it was just great experience until you had started a lawnmower live 15 times in a weekend to talk about how wonderful the lawnmower is. You haven't felt pressure anywhere else, because if the lawnmower didn't fire up, you just knew that it was going to be bad. So you could make sure that lawnmower was really tuned, because
so
that's
when you
what we
did the
did.
Sears commercial,
it was live.
You started the Sears lawnmower. Is that
right
correct?
there on the air?
Right
Actually,
on
it was
the
the flip. It was the first lawnmower you had that you could do. You could wind it up and flip it and make it start.
Right.
And the darn thing started every time. But I always thought to myself, what in the world was I going to do if the
You were
darn
demonstrating
thing
that.
wouldn't start?
And while you were at TVD, in fact, Floyd Fletcher sold the station to
it was in that era. I think that he sold it to them and then he stayed there.
Cap
But Mr.
Cities.
Fletcher was big time. I was an announcer. I had a program director. I didn't really know him. He was just this gray eminence somewhere upstairs who seemed to preside over it all.
Mm-hmm.
Very
And
important man.
Did you also work at WRAL at that time?
That came later. I had really liked the radio business better than the TV business, because radio was simpler. You could do things that were more spontaneous. I was really interested in the news part, and Ty Boyd offered me an opportunity to come back to CHL to do some more responsibility, but I'm a little fuzzy on just when that lasted. But I was at the TV station for about a year, and then went back to CHL, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, I got a call from the producer of what was going to be a bowling show on WRAL TV, and and I went over and I didn't exactly read for it. I just talked, and they said, "Okay, this is good. What do you know about bowling?" I said, "I don't know anything about bowling," and they all conferred, and they said we didn't know any announcers who knew anything about bowling. And they says, "Well, would you be willing to take a course in bowling?" And I said, "If it'll put me on TV live on Sunday night, and I'm still doing the WCHL thing for Ty, that is just as good as it can get." And so they sent me to Bethesda, Maryland, to a 5-day bowling instructor program. So I learned all the language and all the things. And so not only did I become the host of North Carolina's first, and I might say only, live television bowling show, but I also became a certified American Bowling Congress bowling instructor in the process.
And what was the name of the show?
It was just live from Sportland, something to that effect.
And was Sportland a bowling alley?
It was the bowling place in Raleigh. They had one in Raleigh, Durham, and Rocky Mount.
And so the show was actually done live from there.
It was done live in Raleigh.
So how did they get the live signal out of Sportland?
I have no idea.
But you were there, and you did the show every Sunday night at 6.
Yeah, and it was all, again, it was all live. That we had heard rumors of this videotape thing that they were entering, but this meant every commercial was live. It was just an incredible experience. I was 19 or 20, maybe 20
so
years
you were a
old,
TV personality, and then
20.
during the week, I guess, you were on radio on WCHL.
Yeah.
And that went on for a few years, and then opportunity knocked.
Yeah, actually, it gets a little complicated in there because I was on television. The owner of the bowling place actually hired me away from CHL at what was, at that time, really a lot of money, and it actually helped a little bit with school. Somewhere along the way, I'm not sure I when. I can't really put my finger on it. I could go find it. Classes got to be less and less, and as I say, I'm still a student. I became a much better student after I quit being a student than I was when I was a student. But I was, because I was doing the bowling show, they wanted to have me doing personal appearances to tell the story of bowling, and we began to run these big bowling clinics at schools. Bowling clinics for 400 kids in PE classes at gymnasiums around, and we filled up the bowling lanes. It was a pretty successful program, and that's what I was doing in 1961.
And about how much money did someone of that stature make at that time?
I don't know, probably $100 a week.
And that was big money.
Yeah, I think because at the TV station, I think I'd been making $70 a week, mm-hmm. and I think it was maybe 65 or 75 at CHL, mm-hmm. and that was about the going rate. I remembered that the director at the TV station, who passed out the checks, when I first got there, thought I was a little uppity because I was making more money than the director. And it was, I think $75, $85 a week there. And then I got, and then 61, lightning struck, the happiest accident in the history of the world, because it was the first time I was rescued. AMF, which was producing all the equipment they were built. Bowling was a huge thing in the
bowling
60s.
Manufacturer, AMF.
AMF, it was 40 people. They were eyeing me to do what I was doing here, to do that nationally. And it was a lot of money, but I mean like triple the money. And I really didn't want to do that. I just wasn't excited about it, but the money sounded great. And then Ty Boyd, about whom I've told, Ty Boyd, on the side while we were doing everything else, he and I were broadcasting the UNC baseball games. And one afternoon, we were sitting there. It had we were in a rain delay in the game, and Boyd looked over at me and he says, "Hev, I've got news for you. You are not going to be working for the bowling people 2 months from now." And I thought, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I am Grady Cole, who was a broadcast legend. He had been on WBT for 30 years, would have 60 shares. You know, like 2/3 of all the homes in the Piedmont Carolinas listen to Grady Cole every morning." And he said, "He is retiring, and I'm going to get his job, and you are going to get mine." 21 years old.
Wow.
And I went. And it was just the most exciting thing, and I never looked back.
And your title was?
Well, I was assistant general manager, program director, sales manager. There were 4 employees, and Sandy was off being mayor, and the civil rights era was taking a lot of his attention.
So you ran the show?
And so I ran the show. I was doing it.
So Ty Boyd moves on. You become the station manager with many, many hats at WCHL, 21 years old.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. And almost, it would be interesting, anyone who knows anything about the business could, if it followed what I'd been doing, could follow what happened, because the truth is that it was a huge responsibility in my eyes, because I really felt that the burden and the opportunity of a station that really was important to the community, but also where we could get a lot of good talent, and trying to find my way was a challenge at that age. And And this is a I think was a time when I learned a lot that I was able to I think process later on as an important lesson about how people can learn. Because Sandy was away being mayor and distracted, he was not there every day, and this meant that I was figuring it out. I talked to Ty a lot. I would go to Charlotte to ask for his input and advice on issues that I was confronting, trying to figure out. But I had an opportunity to learn the business of running it at the same time that I was figuring out how to do it. And I could fill a book with the things that I did wrong. I mean, some of them just egregious, just really stupid stuff, but you tried it. And because Sandy was away being mayor, he wasn't there to observe it or scold me, which I don't think he would have done anyway. But during that period of the first 4 or 5 years we've got there, was really a matter of trial and error. And it was a time, I think, of just enormous growth for me. One of the things that I think served me extremely well and became a linchpin to the success that we had when we started building an organization is that Ty, when he hired me, said, Jim, what we're doing here at WCHL, we're hiring the most talented people that the radio station can afford. And he said to me, now I suspect that this is rhetorical hyperbole, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't the truth, but he says, Jim, if you weren't here, you would be at NBC, which is where you're going to be someday. But for here, we've got you, and he would say, you're first a student at the University of North Carolina, but he says, you're the best talent that this radio station can afford for $1.25 an hour, which was 10 cents more than the minimum wage and more than I'd been making at the News Bureau. So I was excited about that. But what we set into motion was the idea that we weren't interested in full-time professional journeyman announcers who had, you could imagine there were lots of those in small-town radio stations. We had a small-town budget. But because I was a talent groupie, and I mean that in the literal sense of the word, that if you're hiring people who you believe are smarter than you are, and I believe that I was, they may have been a little younger than I was, but not much. If you're hiring people who are smarter than you are, then you treat them that way. And we just had the talent that we brought in from the radio stations, to the radio station, from the university, UNC, and from Duke. The CHL's on-the-air product in terms of the performance of the air people would have played in any town in the Carolinas. I mean, they were great, just great talents.
1960.
Yeah.
You're 21 years old.
Yeah.
You're the manager of WCHL Radio in Chapel Hill.
Yep.
What was the format like? Turn the radio station on in the morning, what would I hear?
You would hear what we called good music.
You were still doing good music.
And it was middle of the road, we would say. And
did you have a news service?
If the Beatles would sing us, if the Beatles had a hit, we would play the Andy Williams version of it.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. So he sang Yesterday, I guess, is that what you're saying?
That's right. Yeah. So we would, yes.
And who was the news service? Was there a national news service?
There was an AP wire service.
AP wire service.
As a matter of fact, we never got a news network until we went full time. It was a daytime radio station.
Okay.
Signed off at sunset until 1968. And then when we became full time in 68, we were able to get a network.
So, remarkable experiences, growth, trial and error, and then, after you've been in the job 7 years, you got a chance to buy a part of the station.
Well, after 3 or 4 years, Mike, I could probably take a half hour of your time describing the remarkable business model that we had for how we sold our advertising. In the beginning, we sort of sold the advertising the way that my dad had picked up dry cleaning. We went to see everybody every week on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and said, would you like to buy some spots? And if they wanted to buy a few spots, we would play them on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday and start all over again next Monday morning, calling on everybody to go sell some radio spots.
Now, tell me one thing right there.
Yeah.
How much was a spot on WCHL in the 1960s?
Well, one thing that was very important, Sandy was absolutely committed to the rate card. Nobody was off the rate card. And when I got there, we moved it from, because I was looking forward, we moved it from 90 cents to $1. And the spots were $1.
For 30 seconds?
Were $1 a piece, that's right. Now we had, and then we began very quickly, and somewhere I think that I figured out that no one cared, and just an audacious move, somewhere about the second year, about 18 months, we went from $1 to $1.50 in one jump.
Wow.
Lots of lectures, but nobody quit. Well, first of all, no one was spending very much money with us. But sales were growing, and progressively, I became immersed. That's when I really became a great student. I started reading everything about the advertising business, everything about the broadcasting business, and everything about sales that I could learn. And somewhere along the way, the concept of consultancy selling, of understanding a client's needs, understanding a prospect's needs, and building a radio campaign for them that wouldn't be just for the next week, but for the next year, was a process that we began to put into place, and it was transformational because we were doing a better job for the advertiser in giving them campaigns that were really made a lot of sense in relation to what they perceived their brand position to be, and it also took less time because you'd set up the program for a year and change copy progressively as you needed to, and in some cases we would write copy for the whole year. Well, the advertisers loved that, and it was a bit ahead of its time at that time. And then I, after 4 or 5 years, decided that we had to grow. And the first salesperson that I hired was a miserable failure. I'd hired a banker. It was a stupid idea, stupidly executed. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how we would go about training a salesperson. And I went over to the business school and to talk to some of the folks that I knew who'd counseled me, and talked to them about the business of how we go about becoming professional in the way that we go about doing this. And we discovered the concept that we were an intangible, and then how do you go about marketing intangibles? That led us to study some businesses that sell intangibles, insurance business, this sort of thing, bonds, other things. And out of that, I developed a program that really just took the modules from those industries and plugged them into the broadcasting business. And I wrote a sales training program that we plugged in that was, it was pretty good. And as we were polishing that up, I would always go to the Radio Advertising Bureau sales clinics because Sandy had told me, go to those clinics, boy. They're real good. You'll learn a lot. Well, I would come back and they were idea clinics, promotional ideas. They were not really very good about sales training, but I got to know the people from RAB. And on one of my trips to New York, I was trying to vet this, and I went up there, I just would see them and I asked them to size up the program, size up what I'd written, and tell me how it might be improved. Well, nobody had done anything like that before. And they said, wow, this is pretty good. And they they asked me to be a speaker at their management conference. And I did one of those, and then they asked me to run their nationwide sales training programs for them. And I was 7 at the time, 27, 28. Well, so we spoke in probably did it for 2 years, 20 cities or so. And what I told Sandy at that time, I said, Sandy, they would like for me to do this, and they were paying me a lot of money for it. And I says, if I continue to have the radio station meet these numbers, because sales were growing up, is this okay with you if I go and do it? And Sandy was very laissez-faire. He said, yeah, because the numbers were more aggressive than he would have projected. And he said, yes. So because you were making a speech, it caused you to people thought that you were more competent than you probably really were, and job offers began to come. And Sandy, when he had hired me in 1961, said, well, it's $125 a week, and if all this works out, maybe I'll sell you some stock someday. Well, that just sounded good to me. I just knew that if I was working for Sandy, it was going to be a good deal, and we didn't talk about it for 6 years. So these jobs started coming in, and I really did not want to go anywhere, but I just loved Chapel Hill, loved being here, and I was keeping the books, so I knew that Sandy could not pay me more. And I said, Sandy, I've got these things that come down. There was one in New York, one in Denver, and they were pretty good jobs. And again, a lot more money, but I didn't want to go there. I just wanted to be in Chapel Hill. I love Chapel Hill. What do you do on Saturday afternoon? Like, you can't possibly have anything as much fun as going to the football game. That was my worldview. And I asked Sandy, how's that stock thing work? And that was he told me what we could do, and I bought 40% of the stock in WCHL that we had the radio station appraised for what he ought to charge for it, and we were billing about $90,000 a year, and the radio station was worth $150,000. So Sandy sold me 40,000. I'm sorry, he sold me 40% of the station for $60,000, and I borrowed and borrowed and borrowed and came up with the money to be able to do that.
And this is about 1966.
66, I would say 66 or 67.
66, 67. So
and
everything went up from there. So the value at that time, $150,000. You borrowed $60,000 for your 40%. And
well, I had saved some money.
Yeah.
I had to borrow $33,000. I had come up with $27,000.
My gosh, that's remarkable.
And in those days, you could do this. Sandy told the fellas at the bank that I was a good boy. He's a good boy. He'll be good for it. And I needed $33,000.
And that's all it took.
And they loaned it to me.
Tell us one other thing, too, and I wanted to ask this question earlier. This is going back a little bit. So who would your biggest advertisers be? You were doing $90,000 a year in revenue at WCHL. Who were your big advertisers, maybe both in name and as in category? Who spent money on radio in 1966,
Belk.
1967?
Our biggest advertiser was the Belk store.
Belk.
Leggett Horton in Chapel Hill. You may remember that the Belk stores had local partner owners.
Right.
And they were our biggest advertiser.
The Belks were out of Charlotte, but of course they had partners in a lot of different places,
Yeah.
and that's exactly what you're talking about. Tell us the name one more time, Belk.
Belk Leggett Horton.
Oh my gosh.
And then it progressively one day became Belk Leggett, and then ultimately became Belk.
And of your $90,000 a year, how much of that do you think was Belk?
Well, that's a good question, because we always worried. Somewhere very early on, I learned, just studying organizational development and when did the company reach a certain level that it became a franchise and not beholden to a given customer. And it was probably, of the 90,000, they were probably spending four or 5,000. We had a lot of advertisers. Had a couple of hundred advertisers on the station.
So who are some of the other big spenders? Car dealers, were they substantial at that time?
Yeah. Somewhat. The big spending car, the big bombastic car dealer thing had not quite hit yet, but the Chevrolet dealer was a big advertiser. The Ford dealership. We did well with appliance stores because they got co-op.
And co-op was big for
co-op,
radio.
meaning the Maytag would pay for half
part of it,
the
right.
bill, or maybe all of it. So we, the tire company would got a lot of co-op.
So this is the beginning of the village companies.
Yes.
And let's tell people what the village companies, what was your vision at that time?
Well, another wonderful story was that I had the great fortune of hiring Roger Jennings. Roger was a graduate student at the time and working for WUNC TV, but he had applied to us for a job as a salesperson. And Roger came in, and very quickly I taught Roger everything that I knew how to do. We spent a lot of time together, and his numbers then became better numbers than my numbers because he didn't have to go through the 5-year learning curve that I did, and he was just very, very successful. So then it was the two of us who were selling. And then we then began hiring one more salesperson per year. We did not want to have, we didn't want to just hire salespeople and put them on the street and tell them what to do. We had made a commitment to training, to hiring the smartest people that we could hire, all of whom were right out of school, and in most cases it might have been right out of graduate school. So they were a little older, but we were getting them very early in their career. And because they didn't have any bad habits that they had learned anywhere else, they were learning about sales development from us. And along the way, this ultimately had to do with how I wound up in the sports business. And also in 1961, when I was hired, 2 months later, Dean Smith was hired as the basketball coach. And we were neighbors. And Dean started doing a daily live radio show I was the morning man also. He was doing the live radio show every morning, a little 5-minute radio interview that he would do on his way to work when he was driving in. And if he was on the road recruiting, he would call in. Because Billy Carmichael, who had been one of my mentors at an advertising agency, he always said the most powerful word in broadcasting is live. So every morning I could say, now live, the Dean Smith basketball show. Well, Dean was 8, nearly 9 years older than I was. And when I'm 21 and he's nearly 30, that made a big difference. And he had spent a lot of time thinking about organizational development. He didn't use those terms, but about team building. And the time that we spent together was not talking about basketball, but it was talking about team development. And on his team, he never, the highest scorer in the game would be the last player that he would mention when talking to the press. It was whoever had set the picks the best, whoever had played the best defense, who had blocked out the best in the game. Because he says, well, the high scorer is going to get all the attention from the newspaper guys anyway. I want to make sure that my guys who are listening to me know what I value. And out of that, we set up from the very beginning, our sales development program included compensation according to the performance of the team and not according to the performance of the individual. And what we were doing from the first day that they started in sales training, we were also training them to be managers, because we said we're going to own more radio stations, because I knew by then that I wanted us to grow. I believed that we would be buying more radio stations. And so that set up a psychological contract in which the senior salespeople, in this case Roger and then George McCall, who went on to have a great career in his late years at WUNC, and then Lee Hauser, who owns a radio station out in the northeastern North Carolina, Elizabeth City, I believe. So you were learning to be both dependent on your teammates for success, cheering for your teammates to succeed, and giving them help where they need it, and it just became a machine that was about as certain to grow. And we always said this was not a get-rich-quick place, but it was a get-rich, almost certain place. And getting rich didn't necessarily mean becoming wealthy. It meant getting rich in whatever way you defined rich. If you came there as an announcer, and if your goal was to be an anchorman at a TV station in Chicago where you'd grown up, then we would lock on to that goal, and we wanted them to salute the company goals, and we would do everything we could do to prepare them for that. And when they graduated from the school, we would become their agent to sell them, to sell the future employer in Chicago on how great they were. And that just built a talent pool. And Mike, the talent pool that we had was extraordinary, and there was a really, I think probably likely a unique commitment to team sales development that nobody else in the business was doing. And that was our secret sauce. So then Roger came to me in 1968 and started telling me about one of our advertisers who had said that Chapel Hill did not have, its newspaper was read by about 30% of the people in town, that we had a prosperous town, and that we needed to do a shopping guide. And Roger Jennings started telling me about this. And I thought it was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard, because I was a radio guy. And Roger campaigned for a year. Took him about a year, as I best recall it, to finally convince me. He walked in one day, a local realtor had come from Canandaigua, New York, and he brought in the shopping guide from Canandaigua, and he stacked them on my desk, and he says, "Big Jim, if you don't do this, somebody will." And I said, "We've got it." And then we started the Village Advocate. And that had the wonderful, accidental, unintended consequence that was not in our place of making us diverse. We were a broadcasting company, and we were then a publishing company. And then we needed to call it something, so we called it the Village Companies.
And the Village Advocate was a bi-weekly?
It was first a weekly shopping guide.
Weekly?
Yes.
Okay.
Delivered, hung on the doorknob. I spent a year, part of what we did, I then spent another year researching it. By the time we produced it, I had traveled around the country, found the best publishers in the business. I'd spent a week out in West Des Moines, Iowa, studying the most successful shopper in the country to find out what they were doing. And it was like, as you can imagine, it was hard clawing at the first. But local advertisers, local businessmen, they had confidence in us, and progressively they came around. And then the tipping point was we got the supermarkets, we got the chain stores, and after that it just took off like a bullet. And for 25 years or so, it was a Chapel Hill staple.
So Jim, you had a wonderful opportunity at 21 years old. You were the announcer that introduced the Dean Smith Show. Did you know that Dean Smith at that point would become a North Carolina legend and really a worldwide legend in college basketball coaching?
No.
But he taught you the importance of teamwork.
Yes. What I knew was that he was a very bright coach. He was different than any other coach that I'd worked with, and he had a cerebral approach to the team building business. And then, see, what most people don't remember is that Dean was hired in the wake of the point fixing scandals, and North Carolina had been placed on probation by the NCAA, and for about 5 years, Dean was restricted in his recruiting, and the schedule was also restricted. And so Dean's first year that he was able to recruit with no restrictions was the beginning of the team that he took to the Final Four 3 straight years. That happened to be when UCLA was the dominant team in the country, and nobody could beat UCLA, but we went to the Final Four 3 straight years. And I watched him grow in the course of all of that.
Now, when did you start doing play-by-play sports with WCHL?
Well, I was doing the baseball games, 61. In addition to the other things we were talking about, morning show and all that business, I would do the baseball games in the afternoon and fly around. We would go to Charlottesville. I would go to the Chapel Hill Flying Club. I would give them, I would pay for the gas, which would be $5, and trade out 10 spots, and they would fly me to the ball game and back.
$5 to fly.
And then Dean wanted the games on WBT.
So Dean Smith does his morning radio show on WCHL. You're the announcer. Time progresses. Things are going well. You've become a 40% owner in the station, and Dean Smith wants his games on WBTV in Charlotte.
Yeah.
What happens?
That came a little later. The progression was that Bill Curry, who was The legendary Mouth of the South was the play-by-play man for the University of North Carolina. Interestingly enough, for those who like to follow the little peculiarities of broadcasting business, if you go back in the early 1960s, there were 2 networks broadcasting the Carolina games. And I'd actually worked for a while with Bill Curry as his color man. I did the games with him for a year or two. I'd forgotten that until now.
And what network was that?
Well, there were 2 networks. There was the Tar Heel Sports Network, and there was the Carolina Radio Network. The Carolina Radio Network was owned by WVOT in Wilson, and I'll think of the name of that wonderful fellow in a moment. At any rate, so when Bill Curry was then hired away to WSOC TV in Charlotte, they wanted their fellow to be the color guy, so I didn't do that for a while. But then Bill, ultimately, at WSOC, he ultimately got fired. He was perhaps as brilliant as any person I've ever sat in a booth with. I mean, a genuinely brilliant person. He had a way with words. He was the best after-dinner speaker I'd ever seen, but he had an aberrational personality that just ultimately got him into trouble. And so I think that I don't know all the details. When he left, the rights for the Carolina games went to the G.H. Johnston Company, which was basically a house organ of the Texaco Company. And so at that time, they made Woody Durham came in, and they had Woody to be the play-by-play guy. He was working at the TV station, and then they hired me as the color guy.
Now, let's talk about what year about would this be?
This would have been around 1970.
Now, when you say he was working at the
71.
TV station, which TV station?
Woody was working for WFMY TV in Greensboro,
okay.
Channel 2 in Greensboro, and he would come over and do the games. And I was at CHL, so both of us were being paid a talent fee. And so we were doing the games and enjoyed that. And then in the G.H. Johnston business model did not suit WBT in Charlotte. And so the games were on in Charlotte on the rock and roll radio station, Big Ways, WAYS, which was a lower power station at 61 on the dial, and WBT was the 50,000 watt clear channel at 1110 on the dial. And so along the way, Dean had said that he wanted the kids he was recruiting in New York City to be able to hear his games on the radio. But at that time, North Carolina State had David Thompson, and they were great. They had Norman Sloan was the coach, and those games were on WBT. And Dean felt that it was a recruiting disadvantage for Norman Sloan to be able to say that his games could be heard in New York City and Dean's games could not. Well, in the meantime, I had good relationships with the folks at WBT. I knew Jim Babb, who was doing the TV. He had run the radio station, and Cully Tarleton and I were involved in the Broadcast Association. And I told Dean, I said, Coach, I think we could figure out how to get those games on WBT if it's important to you. And he said, okay. And I said, well, what we ought to do, he said, why don't you see if you can put that together? So we went down, made a deal with the WPT guys, and the next year we had the network. That's how the network started.
So that started the Tar Heel Sports
That started the Tar Heel Sports
Network. And about what year would that be?
That would have been 1975, 74 or 75, maybe 74 for basketball. The first year, it would have been 75 because we did basketball the first year after NC State had won the national championship. I don't remember that. And it was a coup de grace, big deal in Charlotte for the games to move from one station to the other. And in that process, we then took over football and basketball. And the first year, our rights fee for basketball the first year was $10,000. And the next year we did football and basketball, and they charged more for the football rights than the basketball rights. The football rights were $20,000, and basketball was $10,000. So we paid $30,000 a year for the rights for the first 2 or 3 years. And then after that, it doesn't take long to do this arithmetic. We doubled the rights fee about every 4 years for the next 20 years. Until we kept it until the last contract was $2.5 million a year.
Wow.
To the university, $2.25 million a year.
But it all started out, the flagship was WBT
That's right.
Radio.
Well, they were the most important station on the network. We, of course, on our network, we kept saying WCHL,
right.
Chapel Hill. It was a great branding.
So what other stations were in the network?
Well, it was a very aggressive network. It was the largest network in the state. We had tons of people on the football network. One thing that we did that I was proud of, and I think the university liked it, we wanted every town in the state to have a radio station carrying the Tar Heels. And if they couldn't afford the rights fee, if we genuinely believed they were too small to pay us the $50 a game or the $35 a game, we had 2 or 3 stations that I think paid us $5 a game because we wanted those announcers on those radio stations talking about their Tar Heels. And that worked well.
You know, you have been so influential in North Carolina broadcasting, a remarkable career, 21 years old, managing WCHL, becoming a 40% owner. I believe you eventually bought the station out. In what year would that have been?
So we then then that started a growth spurt.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about your acquisitions.
Yeah, we then started a growth spurt. I was in Boston at doing a sort of a I became a really good student. I've had 2 long stints of sort of industry-directed programs up at Harvard. And I was in Cambridge and saw a retail operation that I liked, and we were in the business of learning about businesses and companies and wound up duplicating it in Chapel Hill. So we started a little art store, art retail, dry mounting, that sort of thing. And that was the next thing that we did. Then we went to, in 1974, when we didn't really know that the interest rate was about to soar, but it was in the middle of a sort of a recession, we again poured out all the money we could borrow and bought an AM and an FM radio station. They were not paired. There was one AM owner and one FM owner, and we bought 2 stations in Lexington, Kentucky in 74. And that took us a while to absorb that. We then opened another couple of retail stores. We acquired the Triangle Pointer that was, because we were in the publishing business, that was the visitor information publication that we put in the hotels in the area. And then the Village Advocate then went from weekly to
bi-weekly.
Weekly. And we then started a printing operation when the Advocate, I didn't really want to be in the printing business. When the Advocate printing bill became big enough with the printer that we were using, we then put an annex on the back of the building, and the printing business became very, very profitable for us for the next 15 years, for as long as we had the Advocate. And then we started a company called the Mall Advocate, which was an advocate that just specialized in promotions for shopping malls, and that was a nationwide operation. And excuse me, we acquired, need to stop and breathe once in a while. We acquired University Directories when it had two contracts to produce college campus telephone directories for 2 schools, UNC and West Virginia. And how we came to have that is a story for another day, but if we have time, we can tell you, because we stumbled into that very inexpensively.
So you were publishing the telephone directories, the numbers for students at UNC Chapel Hill and
West Virginia,
and that was just the beginning.
And that company grew into, in the last 5 or 10 years of University Directories that we owned it, we were doing over 200 campuses and had about 25,000 advertisers nationwide. And it just spawned all sorts of things. And we trained salespeople. That's where our sales training program came in. I would estimate that we trained 7,000 or 8,000 college students in our sales training program. And it was just great. Oh, that, of course, led us to cable TV. And that came through the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters, where Lee Wallenhaupt, who had been the president of the association, and I had been the president of the association, we were on the board together. And Lee was the one who really cornered me, and he said, "Jim, this cable TV thing is coming, and you just better go get it. Just go get it." And Lee was older than me and a little bit of a mentor, so we campaigned for it. It was a huge campaign to get it, but we won. We beat 5 other companies for the Chapel Hill franchise, and then we had 5 other franchises before we sold it. We kept it for several years, and it was different than the other things we had done because it was very capital intensive, had huge margins, and of course had to be really kind of smart to make money with a radio station, because radio stations, or the advertising part of it's fairly management intensive. Cable, if you just don't screw up, you've got to get the pictures out, get the thing. It's really hard not to make money in cable. It was a huge opportunity for us, and we did real well with it.
And you bought additional broadcast properties too, and I'm not sure in the pecking order with Lexington, but you bought a station in Burlington, North Carolina.
Yeah, we bought a station in Burlington. Before we did that, we bought a pair in Wilmington. Mm-hmm. The Dunley family had been there forever, and it had been one of those legacy radio stations. And Mr. Dunley died, and his family sold it to us. And we loved Wilmington. It was really a terrific place. We had great growth down there, and it was the money that we got. We kept that for not very long. We kept that for maybe one of them, we kept the AM for 3 years, and I think the FM for maybe 5 years. And that was the funding that we used to build the cable systems. All of our financing was internal. We never had any outside equity investors.
Very interesting. Let's talk a little bit about your association and the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters. You were the president, I believe, in 1977. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And 77.
Actually, it feels like it was a little earlier. I think it was more like maybe 75. But at any rate, maybe it was in there. Maybe 77.
Okay, but it's a very tumultuous time.
Yeah.
Tell us what was going on then. Jimmy Carter was president. We had the Iran hostage situation. Inflation was picking up, and people weren't feeling great about themselves.
Yeah, interest rate was 21%. It was a wild time. We were in the middle of what most folks call a national malaise, and Jimmy Carter seemed to feed that by talking about it in his fireside chats, in which he would talk about feeling our pain. And my sense was that we were spending too much time in being negative, and we were not celebrating the glories of all the incredible things that happened to be living in North Carolina and be an American. It's an interesting thing. If you, at a dinner conversation, if you ask folks at dinner, and I did this a lot in that era, if you could be anyone you wanted to be at any place in the world and at any time in history, who would you be, where would you be, when would you be there? And most folks have some notion, well, you'd like to be in the Renaissance era, in such a place, and you want to, live on a beautiful desert island or something. Well, the truth is that living here in North Carolina at this time, in this country, in this place, was about as cool as you could get. And if we really dig down into it, most people really don't want to be anybody else. They want to be them. And so we put together a campaign that we called the Spirit of North Carolina campaign. And we didn't have any money. Jim Hunt was about to be elected governor. We knew he was going to win because he was the odds-on favorite. And Swag Grimsley, who I told you about earlier, was his chief of staff. Well, he actually secretary maybe of the Department of Administration or chief of staff, but he was his right-hand man. And we went to Jim Hunt and told him what we had in mind. And I said, I need some money. We needed $10,000. And I said, I want to produce a radio campaign celebrating the character of North Carolina. And we did that. And Chuck Blower, who was a terrific producer out in Los Angeles, had done some things for some churches that had caught my attention about how if someone just said, be sure to put on your overcoat, that was their way of telling you that they loved you. And I liked the tone of that. And so the campaign was called, I like calling North Carolina Home Campaign. And we, with the governor's help, well, what the governor did for us, I said, we need to get these on the radio stations and not just as a public service campaign. So he arranged for Governor Hunt, who was the governor by then, to have a reception thanking and honoring the broadcasters of North Carolina at the governor's mansion. And that evening, all the broadcasters came and we played these songs that I like calling North Carolina home. And Cully Tarleton at WTVD in Charlotte had created a video, a television version of this. And we got the biggest speakers. We put big stereo speakers 6 feet tall on all corners of the place so that when we got ready to play that, it brought tears. It was just great. They were wonderful, inspirational songs. And so we would play those songs and the governor would cry. And we all cried because the governor was crying.
Exactly.
We thought we should all cry. And the governor says, I want you to play these on your radio stations, and here's my pledge card. And so he told everybody to sign a pledge card. How many times a day will you play this? Really? And so all the broadcasters, and then they took a card, and it was something designed to be handed to your traffic department, and we handed them the tapes, and they took their pledge cards and went home, and within a week it was all over every radio station in North Carolina.
Oh my gosh.
And it was, and within a month, everybody in the state could sing I Like Calling North Carolina Home
And
campaign.
even today.
It was terrific.
45 years later, 40 years later,
Yeah.
still, 1977 to 2017, which is today, you mention that and people go, I remember that campaign, and it was so great.
Well, it was just fun.
And
It
that
really
was Jim
fun.
Heavner.
Well, and with the governor and the broadcasters, yeah.
So what happened, Jim? The Tar Heel Sports Network became legendary. Woody Durham, the announcer.
We ultimately hired Woody full time to come over and be our sports director.
Yeah. And he had an illustrious 40-year career.
Yeah.
Everybody that likes Tar Heel sports knows Woody Durham, and many other people, including Jim Heavner. What's the fairy tale ending of this story?
Well, along the way, the greatest burden, I believe, and the greatest talent that I have is one that I'm curious. I just have always had a curiosity that was kind of first revealed itself when I would be a young reporter and go to the press conferences back in the 60s, and all the other reporters would be ready to go home, and I would still have 5 more questions. And I honestly thought that my questions, in a lot of cases, particularly in the sports world, I was more interested in the human part of it than I was who could block and tackle. Dean Smith, interestingly enough, I think liked it that I wasn't very much an expert in basketball, but I was interested a lot in the human development part. And I think that in order to understand others, it's a real good idea to see if you can start by understanding yourself. And so I became, I think, more introspective than the average character in trying to figure out how this kid from Kings Mountain, first kid to go to college among all my cousins, and got here, and then how I was able to do every day the work that I would have paid to do. and went on to not only be able to do the work that I loved to do, which was the reporting and the writing and the people part in the human development, but also I discovered along the way that Sandy made me an accidental entrepreneur. I didn't really have a vision that I was going to own the thing. I just wanted to grow and be a reporter. And I learned along the way that I had a risk profile, that I was willing to take on the risk of being borrowing the money and building the program, but it didn't seem risky to me. It just seemed like the thing to do. And then to have the people that we were able to bring into the company and grow through that were people that when I say that I was honored to be working with them, they may not have always felt that because I was known as a demanding boss. But I knew what their potential was, and I could see what their ultimate capability in our company and beyond could be. And it was just the coolest thing ever. Every day you looked forward to getting there and going to work. And I look back at that and I think about the idea that I got to be the radio guy, the TV guy, that I then got to somehow or another be able to shape a company in whatever my own particular idiosyncratic vision of it might have been. And then to have all that be financially rewarding. When I say doing the work that I would have paid to do, I don't think that I am being terribly media-centric or being short-sighted in that view. Perhaps there were young people at age 11, 12, and 13 looking in the window of the accountant's office wanting to be a bookkeeper. And maybe there were others who were looking in the window of the retail store and looking forward to owning it, but I don't see as many of them as I see of us. Those of us who are lucky enough to have been in the media business are in a business that kids line up to do free. And I started out doing it free. And then one day I started getting paid. And then over the course of the time to get paid as beyond anything I would have ever thought about. I really had not actually thought about the extraordinary benefit of compound growth. An old minister of mine one time it was a part of a tithing sermon, I think. He said there are only 3 certifiable miracles known to man: biological reproduction, photosynthesis, and compound growth. And if you look at our company, we had some years where we grew too fast and we would burn people out. And years when we would grow too slow, and over a period of time, the really great people would not be challenged and it would be hard to keep them there. And somewhere along the way, we found that a sweet spot was about 30% a year. And we grew the village companies, and over the last 20 years of it, owning an average of about 12 companies, we grew at 30% a year for 23 years before we did one of our major liquidity events in the mid-90s. And then out of that, we were able to set up trusts to do things that give us a certain amount of financial security that we wouldn't have otherwise, so that at this stage in the game, I can now think about how much we learned and how much I'm still learning. Charles Crutchfield was the president of Jefferson Pilot Telecommunications. He was an iconic figure, and probably with Wade Hargrove's inspiration, I wound up being appointed to the North Carolina Agency for Public Telecommunications. And I was on that board with Mr. Crutchfield. And I was so impressed to be sitting on a board with Mr. Crutchfield. He was retired by that time. And I would sidle up to Mr. Crutchfield to hear his stories about how it was when he was bringing along these stars at WBT and WBTV. Along the way, I discovered that Charlie, as I came to call him sooner or later, wanted to hear my stories. That he wanted to know what we were doing. He wanted to know about the Tar Heels. He wanted to know about the network. He wanted to know the things I was doing. And then he had the presence of mind to give me some wonderful counsel. And he said, Jimmy said, I really enjoy this. He says, I get to enjoy hearing you tell about what you're doing, knowing that I don't want to go back and do it anymore. So the work that somehow or another you love doing, there's a time and a place and a certain geriatric inevitability as we get older and still have the same enthusiasm for our business, but our duty cycle gets shorter, that we progressively get rid of those things that bring risk and bring responsibility, but the curiosity doesn't go away. And so Charlie told me, he says, and so when you finish all this, he says, Jim, I'm a consultant in Charlotte and I do executive speeches and executive public relations and sort of executive coach management. And he said, it keeps me close to people in the business. And he said, you ought to think about that. So now we've sold all of our operational things. We've been through the typical bumps and bruises. We made a lot of money, lost some money, made money, lost some money. But in the end of the day, the benefit of being an accidental entrepreneur so far outweighed the risks and so far outweighed those sleepless nights when you were wondering if you could get the next thing started up. And Mike, if you know anybody who you think is luckier than me, I'd like to meet him. Because I think it's, really, if I'm not the luckiest guy in the world, I don't know who is. I'm working now on writing some stuff for my grandkids about all of this, and I don't know what we're ultimately going to call it. But right now I'm working on, the idea that I'm working on right now is that I think it's a story. It's the greatest life I've ever lived. And I'm really, really lucky.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that with us today. It's a great story, and it's one that needs to be told.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.